There is something underneath British Columbia that the maps don't show. Not a rumor. Not kind of thing people whisper about on the internet and later regret. Something documented in engineering reports. Something photographed by construction workers who were told, immediately, firmly, to seal what they had found and say nothing. Something noted in memos that sat in city archives for decades, gathering dust, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The question is simple. What is beneath this place? The answer is not. Beneath the streets of Victoria, Canada's most self-consciously charming city, a city that trades on the image of its own orderliness. There are passages whose origins no official source can fully explain. Passages of dry-fitted stone that predate the colonial brick laid around them. Passages mapped by no city planner, acknowledged by no heritage survey, understood by no single historian with access to the complete picture. Beneath the Fraser Valley, beneath the cedar-scented soil that millions of people walk across every single day, there are tunnels that are older than the roads above them. Tunnels carved for purposes that the official record never adequately preserved. Tunnels that keep surfacing, literally, every time someone digs deep enough, and keep getting sealed back up every time they do. And beneath the coastal bluffs of British Columbia, a geomorphologist reviewing LiDAR survey data in 2019 flagged a finding so anomalous that he included it in his formal assessment report. He described a series of interconnected subsurface voids running along the cliff face. Voids that had no natural geological explanation he could account for. He recommended investigation. The agency that commissioned the survey noted his recommendation, filed it, moved on. His report is still in their offices. Nothing has happened. This is the story of what lies beneath British Columbia. All of it. The indigenous pathways that predate every European footprint on this coast by thousands of years. The survival infrastructure that a persecuted community built beneath Victoria when the surface world became too dangerous to inhabit freely. The wartime underground that the Canadian military constructed and has never fully declassified. The tunnels that gold miners broke into and couldn't explain. The passages that construction workers keep finding and keep being told to bury. This is the story of what it means for a place to have a history it has never been allowed to fully remember. We're going underground. Historians have a Latin word for the gaps in the record, lacunae. From the word for pit, for hole, for void. British Columbia has more lacunae than it should, not because the province's past was uneventful. Not because the people who lived here failed to leave traces, but because the institutions that did the recording made very deliberate choices about which traces were worth preserving. This is not a controversial claim. It is the foundational insight of the last 50 years of years of colonial history scholarship, and it applies here with particular force. When Captain James Cook arrived at Nootka Sound in 1778, he catalogued everything he encountered with the systematic attention of a man trained to believe he was the first. His journals are meticulous. His observations are detailed and often accurate. What they cannot record, what Cook had no framework for recording, is the depth of the world he was observing, the generations of knowledge encoded in the people he met, the centuries of relationship with a landscape that included its underground dimensions. Cook saw a coast. The people who lived there saw everything. When the Hudson's Bay Company established Fort Victoria in 1843, it kept records of every transaction that mattered to the Hudson's Bay Company: fur inventories, trade ledgers, personnel files. What it did not keep records of was the indigenous geography the fort was built on top of. What it did not preserve was the knowledge systems of the Lekwungen people, who had occupied that southern tip of Vancouver Island for generations, and who understood its underground in ways that the fort's administrators had no interest in learning. When the colonial government of British Columbia began building a province in the second half of the 19th century, it built a bureaucracy that documented what bureaucracies document: land titles, census returns, court records, legislative proceedings, the lives of Chinese laborers who drove tunnels through the Rockies and died in numbers. The government never bothered to count accurately. Those lives were not considered worthy of detailed documentation. The knowledge of indigenous nations whose territories the province was being built on top of was not considered legitimate historical evidence. It was considered folklore. This is where the gaps come from. Not from an absence of activity, from an absence of interest in documenting certain kinds of activity. And when you try to trace what lies beneath British Columbia, when you try to understand the full range of what has been built and dug and carved beneath the surface of this province, you are working against the specific shape of those gaps. You are trying to read a document where entire pages have been left blank, and the blank pages are not random. They follow a pattern. The pattern is who was considered worth documenting and who was not. The consequences of this pattern are not merely academic. They are physical. They are architectural. They are the reason that when a construction crew in Victoria breaks through a basement floor in 1981 and finds themselves looking into a passage of dry, fitted stone that predates any construction on the official record, the city's response is to photograph it, file a memo, and move on. Because there is no institutional framework for what they found. There is no category in the official understanding of Victoria's underground for a pre-colonial stone passage beneath the Chinatown district. And without a category, the thing that was found becomes administratively invisible. Understanding British Columbia's underground requires building that category from scratch. It requires treating the oral traditions of Indigenous nations as historical records rather than mythology. It requires reading the accidental discoveries documented in construction logs as archaeology rather than inconvenient interruptions to development schedules. It requires understanding that the shape of the gap, the specific outline of what is missing from the official record, is itself a form of evidence. The lacunae are the story, and the story begins, as the deepest stories in this province always do, not with European arrival, not with the trading companies and the colonists and the railway builders, but with the people who were here before all of them. People who had been here for so long that the underground they knew had been built and used and maintained across a span of time that makes the colonial period look like an afternoon. To understand what is beneath British Columbia, you have to start at the beginning, the actual beginning, not 1843. Not 1778, not the gold rush or the railroad or Confederation, 14,000 years ago, at least. The archaeological evidence for human presence on the British Columbia coast dates back at least 14,000 years. That number, 14,000, is not an abstraction. It is a span of time longer than the entirety of recorded human civilization in the Old World. It represents hundreds of generations of people who knew this landscape, who lived in it and on it and beneath it, who developed over those millennia an understanding of this particular piece of the earth that no outsider has ever approached. Some of those people, and this is documented, this is in the peer-reviewed archaeological literature, used the underground, not metaphorically, physically. The oral traditions of Indigenous nations across British Columbia describe underground passages with a specificity that the academic establishment spent most of the 20th century misclassifying as mythology. The Nlaka'pamux people of the Fraser Canyon region have accounts of underground passages connecting different locations along the canyon walls as passages used for movement, for storage, for shelter. The Sequepem have stories about cave systems that served as refuge in times of danger. The Stow Low, whose territory stretches across a long reach of the Fraser River Valley, have oral accounts of underground spaces used for purposes that blend the practical and the ceremonial in ways that European categorical thinking has always struggled to accommodate. In the last several decades, a growing body of archaeological anthropology has been insisting on something that the evidence fully supports. Oral traditions are not myths in the dismissive, modern sense of the word. They are records. In cultures that did not use written language, oral tradition was the primary technology of information storage, and it was refined over thousands of years to be precise, robust, and resistant to distortion. When an elder describes a specific underground passage at a specific location with specific geographical details, that description is not folklore. It is documentation. There is a site in the Stein Valley, a site with no name in any government database, though it has a name in the language of the Nlaka Pamux people who have known it for generations, where a narrow opening in the cliff face leads into a chamber roughly 12 meters across. The ceiling rises to 8 meters at its highest point. The walls are covered in ochre pictographs, hands, spirals, figures that may be human or may be something else, animals and geometric patterns whose meaning has never been publicly decoded. The floor of that chamber is flat, not naturally flat. Flat in the way that floors are flat when someone has leveled them. There is evidence of sustained fire use in carbon deposits on the ceiling and the remnants of hearth structures in the stone. And at the far end of the chamber, behind a deliberate rockfall that partially blocks the passage, a tunnel begins. No comprehensive survey of that tunnel has ever been conducted. The portions that have been documented, roughly 40 meters, end where the passage becomes too narrow or too dangerous to proceed without specialized equipment. Where it goes after that, whether it connects to other chambers or emerges somewhere else entirely, whether it is natural formation or shaped by human hands, remains unknown. The site is on First Nations land. Access is controlled by the local band. The investigation that would answer those questions has not been conducted, partly because the funding hasn't materialized, and partly because the institutional relationships that would make such an investigation that possible take years to build. What has been built and what that chamber represents is this. The underground was a known and intentional space for the people who lived here. Not an accident of geology that they stumbled into, but a resource they understood, maintained, and passed knowledge of from generation to generation. The Forbidden Plateau tells a version of the same story, one that's darker and more revealing about what European settlement chose not to understand. The plateau rises above the Comox Valley on central Vancouver Island, taking its English name from a Comox oral account recorded by European settlers in the 19th century. The account describes the plateau as a dangerous place, a place where women and children were taken during a period of warfare and from which they never returned. The settlers who recorded this story filed it as a colorful local superstition. What they didn't investigate, what researchers only began to seriously consider much later, is the possibility that the Comox account was a literal description of something geological. The Forbidden Plateau sits above a significant cave system. Multiple entrances are known. Surveys conducted by the Vancouver Island Cave Exploration Group over decades, have pushed hundreds of meters into the system before being turned back by flooding or impossibly narrow sections. In at least 2 locations within the explored portions of that cave system, surveyors have encountered features they have described carefully as inconsistent with purely natural formation. A passage segment with walls that appear to have been deliberately smoothed. A section of floor that shows carbon deposition consistent with sustained fire use over a long period. Neither feature has been formally assessed by an archaeologist. The cave systems is not an officially recognized archaeological site. The Vancouver Island Cave Exploration Group is not an archaeological organization. Its members are skilled, careful, observant, and they have reported what they found to the appropriate provincial authority. The appropriate provincial authority has noted the reports. The reports remain in a queue of matters requiring further investigation. That queue is very long. What the Comox oral tradition might actually describe: people going underground during a period of danger and not returning, is consistent with precisely the kind of cave use that the physical evidence in the Forbidden Plateau system suggests. A community taking shelter in an extensive cave system. Something going wrong, no one coming back out. A story preserved in oral tradition for generations, waiting for the researchers who would take it seriously enough to look. The pattern is consistent across the province. Indigenous knowledge of the underground. Specific, geographically detailed, often verifiable against geological evidence when anyone bothers to check, has been treated as legend. The treatment was deliberate. The knowledge being dismissed was real, and the underground that knowledge describes is still there, still largely unexplored, still waiting for the researchers willing to approach it on its own terms. There is more. The connection between the above-ground spiritual geography of British Columbia's First Nations and the physical underground is not incidental. At many Indigenous sacred sites, the point of significance is exactly the boundary between the surface world and what lies beneath it. The cave entrance, the spring emergence point, the place where a river disappears underground. These are not merely symbolic. They mark real geological features, and the distribution of those sacred sites provides, to anyone willing to read the map, a partial guide to the underground geological features that the Indigenous peoples of BC knew and used. We have that map. We have the oral traditions. We have the LiDAR data that, in some cases, confirms the geological features being described. What we have not yet done is treat these sources as the integrated body of evidence they actually are. The question of why we haven't is the same question that runs through everything else about British Columbia's underground. The answer is always some version of the same thing. Because the history that was considered worth recovering was not the history of the people who built those passages. That is changing, slowly, incompletely, against significant institutional inertia. But it is changing. And it is changing in part because the underground keeps surfacing. Literally, in construction projects and renovation work and sewer lines and gas pipe installations across every major city in British Columbia, the thing that was not supposed to be there keeps turning up, keeps announcing its existence, keeps demanding a response that the institutions have not yet found a way to give it. The most demanding of those announcements came from beneath the streets of Victoria, and from a community that built its underground not because it wanted to, but because the world above ground was trying to destroy it. The popular story of the tunnels beneath Victoria's Chinatown is well worn. You can hear a version of it on heritage walking tours. You can read it in tourism brochures. It goes like this. Chinese immigrants built tunnels beneath Fan Tan Alley to conduct illegal activities. Opium dens, gambling, the movement of people trying to evade police. The tunnels were a subterranean city of vice, colorful, dangerous. Now safely historical, this story is not entirely wrong. It is catastrophically incomplete, and the ways in which it is incomplete are precisely the ways in which a comfortable majority history tends to be incomplete when it encounters the evidence of survival strategies used by the people it persecuted. Let's be specific about what the Chinese community in Victoria was actually living through. The Chinese Immigration Act of 1885, better known in the history books as the Chinese Head Tax, imposed a $50 fee on every person of Chinese origin who wanted to enter Canada. This was not a nominal processing charge. $50 in 1885 represented roughly 2 months of wages for a laborer. 2 years later, the fee was raised to $100. In 1903, it reached $500, approximately 2 years of wages for a Chinese laborer at the time. The mathematical message of the policy was clear. We would prefer that you did not come, and if you insist on coming, you will pay for the privilege of your own exclusion. The Dominion Elections Act of 1885 explicitly removed the right to vote from people of Chinese origin. The Opium Act of 1908, which we'll return to, criminalized a substance that had been legally imported and consumed for decades, primarily by Chinese residents who had used it in forms brought from their home provinces. In between these landmarks, there was a continuous parade of provincial and municipal legislation designed to restrict where Chinese Canadians could live, what work they could do, what schools their children could attend, and what legal protections they could claim. This was not a community living on the margins of society by choice. This was a community under sustained legal siege, operating in a city that had structured its laws to make their normal existence as difficult as possible. In that context, hold that context. The tunnels beneath Chinatown were not criminal infrastructure. They were survival infrastructure. The word matters. Infrastructure is what you build when you intend to stay. When you are committed to persisting in a place, regardless of what that place does to make you leave. The passages beneath Fan Tan Alley and the surrounding blocks allowed people to move through the city without exposing themselves to harassment, arbitrary arrest, or the kind of official extortion that flourished when an entire community was legally precarious. They allowed goods, legal goods, taxed goods, goods that had every right to be in transit, to move without inviting the attention of police officers who did not distinguish between legal and illegal activity when the people involved were Chinese. They allowed community gatherings to take place in spaces that were not visible to a government and a police force that treated visibility as vulnerability. The extent of the network at its peak, roughly from the 1880s through the 1920s, is, to be precise about it, unknown. This is not a historian's evasion. The tunnels were designed to be unknown. The people who built and maintained them were not keeping records intended for posterity. They were building an infrastructure of invisibility, and they built it well. What we know comes from the accidents of subsequent construction. And those accidents have been both numerous and consistently under-investigated. In 1981, workers excavating for a development project on Fisgard Street broke through a concrete floor and found themselves looking into a passage approximately 1.5 meters wide and 2 meters tall, running beneath the street. The passage was partially silted. The walls told an unexpected story. There was 19th century brick construction. Yes, but the brick had been laid around something older, a rough-cut stone passage that the brick appeared to be lining rather than creating. The stonework was not in any city record. No one in the construction crew had known it was there. The project was halted. An investigation was conducted. The passage was photographed. Then it was filled in and built over. The documentation from that investigation, a handful of photographs, and a short bureaucratic memo in the City of Victoria's archives, describes the find in careful language and recommends further research. It recommends that an archaeologist assess the older stone construction phase, which the memo's author notes cannot be dated without laboratory analysis. No archaeologist was ever called. No further research was ever conducted. In 1967, sewer work near Government Street uncovered a sealed room with a brick-vaulted ceiling that was not on any plan the city possessed. In 1994, foundation work for a parking structure encountered a horizontal passage running perpendicular to the established street grid, running in a direction inconsistent with the brick-era construction of the surrounding blocks, suggesting it predated the neighborhood's development. In 2008, a ground-penetrating radar survey conducted ahead of a streetscaping project returned readings beneath a 2-block section of Pandora Avenue that the interpreting contractor described as consistent with large subsurface voids. The City of Victoria's official position across all these discoveries has been consistent and, technically speaking, defensible. The tunnels are real but limited in extent, dating primarily from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the city monitors them as a safety matter. This position answers almost none of the substantive historical questions. An American archaeologist who came to Victoria in 2016 specifically to study the underground left with a conclusion that went considerably further than the city's official position. He circulated a report privately and then withdrew it from circulation for reasons he has not explained publicly, that described the Victoria Tunnel network as a palimpsest, a layered document, multiple construction phases built on top of each other over different eras, representing the work of different hands at different times for different purposes. He identified at least 3 distinct phases: recent 20th century concrete, 19th century brick, and an older phase of dry-fitted stone construction that he could not date without equipment he had not brought. He was explicit about the limits of his conclusion. He declined to say whether the older phase was pre-colonial. He did not speculate about connections to Indigenous oral traditions. What he did say in the report that was circulated and then withdrawn was this: the dry-fitted stone construction was unlike anything he had previously encountered in a North American colonial context, and it deserved serious archaeological attention. It has not received that attention. Not publicly, not on the record. This is the pattern. Find. Document briefly. Bury. Recommend follow-up. Follow-up never comes. Every iteration of the pattern represents something lost. Every sealed passage takes with it whatever it might have told us about the people who made it and the circumstances that made it necessary. The Chinese-Canadian community of Victoria's Chinatown built something extraordinary beneath this city. An infrastructure of survival that sustained a community under conditions that would have destroyed most communities. And the official historical record has never given it the attention it deserves. Part of the reason it hasn't is the story of opium. Because the story of opium is the story of how a legal industry became a criminal one, and how that transformation was used to retroactively criminalize the community that had operated it legally. And that is a story that deserves its own full accounting. opium was legal in Canada until 1908. This is not a revisionist claim. It is a historical fact documented in customs records, excise tax returns, and the official reports of government inspectors who visited licensed manufacturing facilities and signed off on their operations. Victoria had multiple licensed opium factories during the legal era. They were real businesses with real addresses. They employed workers, paid taxes to the Dominion government, and produced a product that was sold openly across Canada and exported to the United States. The product was not hidden. The factories were not hidden. They were registered, inspected, and taxed. The tunnels that connected these factories to their storage facilities and distribution points were not criminal infrastructure. They were commercial infrastructure. The movement of goods through underground passages rather than street-level corridors was an efficiency measure and a security measure. So security against the kind of arbitrary interference from police officers and city officials that the Chinese community had learned to expect regardless of the legal status of what they were doing. Then came 1907. Then came the anti-Asian riots in Vancouver, in which white mobs attacked the Chinese and Japanese districts, destroying property and assaulting residents. Then came the Royal Commission investigation led by Mackenzie King, then the Deputy Minister of Labor, who was sent to assess the damage and recommend policy responses. King's investigation found something that made the political establishment profoundly uncomfortable. The Chinese community's opium business was generating substantial wealth, legal, taxable, documented wealth, concentrated in a community that the establishment had been systematically trying to impoverish through the head tax and its associated legislation. The opium industry was evidence that the persecution was not working, that the community was not being driven out, that it was, in fact, thriving. The Opium Act of 1908 was, among other things, an economic weapon. Criminalization of opium did not eliminate the substance. It eliminated the legal industry that produced it, destroyed the wealth infrastructure that had grown up around it, and transformed the community's most successful economic sector into criminal activity, activity that then justified the police surveillance and legal harassment that the community had been subjected to all along. When opium became illegal, the tunnels that had moved it legally kept moving it illegally. The infrastructure was already built. The organizational knowledge was already in place. The Tong associations, the Chinese fraternal organizations that were the backbone of Chinese-Canadian community life, managed this transition the same way they managed everything else. Quietly, effectively, and with an institutional continuity that the outside world consistently underestimated. The word Tong means hall, a place of gathering. The Tongs were not criminal enterprises. though they have been persistently described as such in accounts written by people who found their existence inconvenient. They were mutual aid societies. They functioned as employers, as banks, as dispute resolution bodies, as community welfare systems, as cultural preservation organizations for communities that were excluded from every formal institution the surrounding society offered. They were also the organizations responsible for maintaining the underground infrastructure. Not because their primary purpose was illicit commerce. It was not, but because the underground was the infrastructure of community survival, and the tongs were the institutions responsible for community survival. This meant that the tunnel network was not merely dug and left. It was maintained, extended, modified as conditions changed and needs shifted. Knowledge of the network, its extent, its condition, its entry and exit points, its vulnerabilities, was systematically passed from one generation of community leadership to the next. The underground had institutional custodians. It was a managed resource. This is historically significant for a reason that goes beyond the tunnels themselves. It means that at some point within living memory, within the lifetime of people who have since died, within the knowledge of families who are still here, there were individuals who could have walked a researcher through the complete underground, who could have provided, from memory and institutional transmission, a map of something that no archaeological survey has ever been able to fully reconstruct. That knowledge is almost certainly gone now. The Tong system declined across the middle decades of the 20th century. As immigration patterns shifted, as the legal environment improved incrementally, as the communities themselves changed, the institutional knowledge of the tunnel network went with it. The people who could have been the primary sources for the most complete accounting of the Victoria Underground were not consulted. They died, and their knowledge died with them. What survives in fragments, in family oral traditions, in the occasional detail that surfaces in community history projects, in the physical evidence that keeps turning up in constructions, excavations, and then gets sealed back under concrete. There is a loss here that goes beyond the historical record. The Victoria Tunnel Network was not just infrastructure. It was evidence. Evidence that a community that was told it did not matter, that its survival was not a legitimate concern of the society around it, built something that lasted, that persisted, that is still physically present beneath the streets of a city that has never adequately acknowledged what was done to the people who built it. That evidence deserves better than the treatment it has received, and the wartime underground that came after it. The underground that the Canadian military built when the Pacific became a potential theater of war was treated no better by the institutions responsible for preserving and explaining it. We're going to the war years now, to the secret that the Canadian government has been deferring to acknowledge for more than 80 years. June 20th, 1942. The Estevan Point Lighthouse on the west coast of Vancouver Island was shelled by a Japanese submarine. This is not a matter of dispute or legend. It is one of the only attacks on Canadian territory during the Second World War. And it happened here on this coast. The Japanese balloon bomb campaign sent incendiary devices across the Pacific on jet stream currents, landing in the BC interior and causing a small number of casualties. Japanese forces occupied the Aleutian Islands at the western end of the Alaskan chain, bringing the theater of Pacific conflict within theoretical striking distance of the Canadian coast. The threat was real. The Canadian military knew it was real. And the response, the fortification of the Pacific coast, was more extensive than anything in the public record fully describes. In Vancouver, the wartime preparations included underground facilities that the official history acknowledges in outline and declines to detail. The military tunnels beneath Hastings Park, which served simultaneously as a military staging area, and in one of the war's more troubling chapters, as an internment site for Japanese Canadians, are partially documented. Coastal defense installations on the western shores of the city required underground ammunition, storage, and command infrastructure that is referenced in military history sources without being mapped or measured. But there are accounts, consistent accounts, coming from multiple independent sources, combining anecdotal testimony with the physical evidence of accidental construction discoveries of a wartime underground considerably more extensive than the official record describes. These accounts describe a tunnel system connecting the downtown core of Vancouver to installations on the North Shore, potentially traversing the bed of Burrard Inlet. They describe underground facilities beneath the University of British Columbia campus that the university's official history has never fully addressed. They describe connections between the wartime underground and earlier infrastructure. The CPR tunnels, the drainage systems, the pre-war basement networks of the waterfront district that suggest a more systematic integration of underground than any single official source acknowledges. Are these accounts accurate? This is where the documentary record becomes genuinely frustrating. Canada's wartime records, including those held at Library and Archives Canada, are not fully declassified. Not now, more than 80 years after the events in question. The stated reason is national security. which, in the context of infrastructure information, means that the concern is less about military secrets from a war that ended in 1945 and more about contemporary security concerns related to critical infrastructure knowledge. This is a legitimate position. It is also, as a matter of historical transparency, deeply unsatisfying. The people who built and used those wartime tunnels are gone. The military necessity that justified classification has been over for 8 decades. The continued classification of these records represents a choice, an ongoing, actively maintained choice, to keep significant portions of British Columbia's history out of the public domain. CFB Esquimalt, on the southern tip of Vancouver Island, sits at the center of the wartime underground story, WWII, and at the center of the most carefully maintained official silence about it. The naval base has been present on Esquimalt Harbor since the Royal Navy established itself there in the 1840s. It is built on land that had been a Lekwungen village for generations before the first British warship anchored in the harbor. The base that has grown over the subsequent century and a half is one of the most strategically significant military installations on the North American West Coast, and its underground is correspondingly opaque. What is known and not secret? CFB Esquimalt has tunnels. The base's own published histories acknowledge underground infrastructure dating to the early 20th century. What is classified, what has been explicitly restricted, is the current extent of the underground at Esquimalt, what it connects to, how deep it goes, whether the military infrastructure intersects with natural cave systems or with older, pre-military features in the area. Former personnel who worked at Esquimalt describe, always carefully, always short, always of what would constitute a classified disclosure, an underground that is considerably more extensive than anything documented in accessible sources. They describe passages of a scale and construction quality, implying purposes beyond utility, not just pipes and cables, not just internal connection corridors, but substantial underground spaces with independent environmental controls and infrastructure. And in the most carefully worded of these accounts, they describe connections between the military underground at Esquimalt and the civilian underground of the city of Victoria, 4 kilometers to the east. Whether this reflects reality or represents the accumulated elaboration of workplace rumor around classified facilities cannot be determined from outside. What it represents, at minimum, is consistent testimony from independent sources that the underground beneath the Victoria region extends well beyond what any public survey has documented. The wartime underground story extends up the coast to Prince Rupert. And in Prince Rupert, it takes on a quality of urgency that the southern city's stories lack, because the window for collecting living testimony about what was built there is closing. Prince Rupert sits at the mouth of the Skeena River, just south of the Alaska Panhandle. During World War II, its strategic position, closer to the North Pacific shipping lanes than any other Canadian city, made it a priority in the military's Pacific defense planning. The city's population nearly doubled between 1940 and 1945 as military personnel and construction workers arrived to build and operate facilities that included a major naval base, an Air Force station, and a prisoner of war camp. The scale of construction was extraordinary for a city of Prince Rupert's size, and it happened quickly, which meant it happened without the documentation that slower, better resourced construction would have produced. Prince Rupert is built on bedrock. Basalt. The rock rises through the surface in outcrops throughout the town site, and it was recognized by military engineers as ideal for underground construction. Structurally resilient, resistant to bombing, naturally temperature stable, easy to seal. They used it. What exactly they built underground in Prince Rupert is not fully known. Official accounts acknowledge underground ammunition storage, fuel storage, communications facilities, but civilian testimony, collected by local historians from the 1970s onward, describes a wartime underground that exceeds the official accounting. A network of passages connecting the main waterfront installations. Underground facilities near the Cominco Water Tower that were sealed after the war and have never been reopened. A passage reportedly running from the downtown area to the Naval Fuel Depot on the opposite side of the harbor. A 2011 engineering assessment commissioned by the city identified 3 locations in the downtown area where bedrock had been cut in ways consistent with wartime military construction. The assessment recommended monitoring. The veterans who built these tunnels are gone. The civilians who watched them work are aging. The institutional memory of what was built beneath Prince Rupert during the war is disappearing at the rate of 1 person at a time, and no one has yet made the systematic effort to collect it before it closes entirely. This is another version of the same failure. The evidence exists, the sources exist. The institutional will to gather and preserve them does not. Not all of British Columbia's underground was built by people under siege. Some of it was built by people pursuing opportunity. Sometimes legal opportunity, sometimes not. In a landscape that offered natural concealment to those who knew how to read it. The Fraser Canyon Gold Rush of 1858 brought 20,000 to 30,000 people into one of the most geologically dramatic corridors in North America in a matter of months. The canyon cuts through mountain ranges that took millennia to form, the river churning through passages that the geological forces of the continent spent millions of years creating. The underground of the canyon, the natural cave systems in its walls, the passages carved by ancient water, the fault line fractures running through its bedrock, was already vast before a single prospector arrived. The Royal Engineers came in behind the gold rush, tasked with building a road through terrain that resisted every effort to make it passable. The Caribou Wagon Road, one of the genuine engineering achievements of 19th century Canada, required tunnels. These are documented in the official record, referenced in Colonel Richard Clement Moody's dispatches, and in the memoirs of the men who built them. But alongside the documented Royal Engineers tunnels, there are accounts of passages in the canyon walls that are not in any official record. Passages that the gold rush miners encountered and could not account for. Passages that the indigenous oral traditions of the Nlaka'pamux describe as existing long before European contact. The most specific of these accounts comes from the journal of a miner named Elias Thornton, who worked the Fraser River bars in 1859 and 1860. Thornton's journal is not the work of a man given to fabrication or dramatic embellishment. It is a methodical daily record. Weather, expenses, work completed, brief social observations from the camp. His entry for September 14, 1859, is the anomaly. He describes following a companion into what calls, in the precise language of a man trying to describe something he has no category for, a passage in the cliff cut by hands far older than any we have encountered. He gives a location above the fourth bar below Spuzzum, which is a real and identifiable point in the canyon. He describes the passage as taller than a man, wide enough for 2 men abreast, with walls too smooth for natural rock formation, and a floor worn flat as the stones of a cathedral. He says the passage extended beyond the reach of their torchlight. His companion, a veteran prospector who had worked mines in Nevada and California, told Thornton that he had seen similar passages in the hills above Sacramento, and that he had been told by a California Indian that such passages were old beyond the memory of any living man. When Thornton's journal was donated to the BC Archives in 1974, the archivist who cataloged it classified his September 14th entry as containing folklore elements. It was not cited in subsequent gold rush histories. The classification of the entry as folklore was not the result of analysis. It was the result of default. The archivist had no framework for a 19th century miner's eyewitness account of a pre-colonial underground passage, so he placed it in the category of things that could be safely set aside. In light of the archaeological evidence for human occupation in the Fraser Canyon stretching back thousands of years, that classification looks less like careful scholarship and more like a failure of imagination. The canyon has been studied by archaeologists repeatedly and with increasing sophistication. prompted by the requirement to assess potential impacts of successive infrastructure projects, expansions, pipeline corridors, dam construction along the river system. Each project has required archaeological assessment, and each assessment has found evidence of occupation and activity that extends the known timeline of human presence in the canyon. None of these assessments has specifically investigated the underground passages Thornton described. Not because the question was asked and answered. Because the question was never asked. The coastal underground tells its own story, and it is a story with better documented physical evidence, even if that evidence has been consistently left in the custody of people who don't have the tools to assess it properly. British Columbia's Prohibition era. The province voted for prohibition in 1916 and implemented it the following year. Did not produce the results its advocates had anticipated. The province's coastline, with its thousands of miles of inlets and islands and concealed coves, was simply too well suited to smuggling for enforcement to be effective. The legal export business, shipping alcohol from BC to foreign destinations, including the United States, where prohibition was federal law, was technically legal under Canadian law for much of the period. And it was used as cover for a wholesale smuggling operation that supplied American customers from California to Alaska. The infrastructure of this trade made extensive use of the coast's natural underground. Limestone caves were modified with stone shelves for storage. Natural sea caves were fitted with drainage channels, cliff face openings that were invisible from the water at high tide were expanded and equipped to serve as loading points for small boats working after dark. In 2003, hikers near Lund, north of Powell River, discovered a chamber in a coastal cliff that had clearly been modified from its natural state. Stone shelves on two walls, too regular to be natural. A drainaged channel cut into the floor with tools. The corroded remains of a mechanical pump. The chamber had an entrance that had been widened and a ceiling that bore the evidence of extended use. Local historians consulted about the discovery identified it as consistent with a Prohibition-era storage facility. No official archaeological investigation was conducted. The chamber was noted in a regional heritage database. It was effectively forgotten. Similar discoveries have been made near Sechelt, on Cortes Island, on Quadra Island, at multiple points along the eastern coast of Vancouver Island. Each documented briefly, each left uninvestigated. The cumulative picture, they suggest, is of a remarkably extensive coastal underground, built during the Prohibition era, the majority of which has never been formally assessed. And then there is Barkerville, the largest city west of Chicago and north of San Francisco during the Caribou Gold Rush of the 1860s. A boomtown at the end of the world, built on ground that was literally being excavated beneath it as it grew. Barkerville is now a provincial heritage site. Tourists walk its reconstructed streets, watch costumed interpreters demonstrate the life of a gold rush town, and take photographs of buildings that look exactly as they would have in 1870. What the heritage interpretation does not adequately explain is that the ground they are walking on is hollow. The miners who worked Barkerville were driving shafts deep into the earth, following the ancient stream channel that lay beneath the creek, pursuing the gold wherever it led. The underground beneath the reconstructed facades is a complex of old mine workings, shafts, horizontal drifts, timbered section decaying for a century and a half, interconnected passages running in multiple directions. The provincial heritage site monitors for subsidence. It does not present the underground as a historical resource in its own right. The Duke-Hobor settlements of the Kootenay region add yet another layer, one that is almost entirely absent from mainstream accounts of British Columbia's past. The Duke-Hobors were Russian religious dissenters who arrived in Canada in 1899 and established communal settlements in the Kootenay region from 1908 onward. They were pacifists. They refused individual land ownership, mandatory schooling, and oaths of allegiance to the Crown. The Canadian government responded with land seizures, child apprehension, and imprisonment. The Duke-Hobor response to official pressure included, among other strategies, building underground, root cellars and storage chambers dug into hillsides. Practical in the Kootenay climate, useful for food storage, and harder for government officials to find and inventory. The communal village sites near Castlegar, Grand Forks, and along the Kettle and Kootenay rivers had extensive below-grade infrastructure that contemporary accounts describe as substantial. A comprehensive archaeological survey of the former Duke-Hobor communal sites, including their underground infrastructure, has never been conducted. The Duke-Hobor underground connects to the larger story in a specific and important way. It is another case where underground construction was the rational response to a hostile surface world. Different community, different faith, different mechanisms of persecution. The same logic. When the world above ground is trying to destroy you, you build below it. This logic runs through the entire history of British Columbia's underground. And understanding it, really understanding it, not just as a colorful historical footnote, but as a pattern that reflects something fundamental about how power operates in this province, is the prerequisite for understanding what the underground actually is. It is an archive. A physical record of the lives of people who could not be present in the official record. A document written in stone and brick and timber by hands that the institutions above ground chose not to acknowledge. And the technology that is only now becoming available to read that document, is doing something that none of the researchers who have worked on this Aztec's question have ever had access to before. It is seeing through the surface. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. The technology uses laser pulses fired from aircraft to build three-dimensional models of terrain with a resolution that ground-level surveying cannot match. It was originally developed for purposes that had nothing to do with archaeology. It has become one of the most powerful archaeological tools in existence. The reason is simple. It sees through forests. In regions like British Columbia, where centuries of tree growth can completely conceal what lies beneath the canopy, LiDAR has revealed things that human observers walking the same terrain for generations had never detected. Maya cities in Guatemala, Angkor's full extent in Cambodia, road networks, canal systems, building foundations, all hidden beneath jungle, all suddenly visible when the laser data was processed and the vegetation digitally stripped away. In British Columbia, LiDAR surveys have been conducted for decades, primarily for purposes that have nothing to do with archaeology. Forestry management, utility corridor planning, coastal monitoring, infrastructure assessment. The data from these surveys exists. It is held by the agencies that commissioned the surveys, and it is available to researchers with the right institutional affiliations and access permissions. When archaeologists and geomorphologists have been able to examine that data, and they have in fragments in the margins of projects with other primary mandates, what they have found has been consistently suggestive and consistently underfollowed. The 2019 case is the clearest example. A geomorphologist reviewing LiDAR data collected for an infrastructure planning survey along a British Columbia coastal section identified anomalies that he could not account for through natural geological processes. His formal assessment report, WWII, described a series of interconnected subsurface voids running along a coastal bluff, voids with no natural explanation in the local bedrock geology. He flagged the finding. He recommended investigation. He wrote this into the formal report, which means it is a documented recommendation from a credentialed professional, not a casual observation. The agency that commissioned the survey noted the recommendation. They noted that it fell outside the scope of their mandate. Infrastructure planning, not archaeology. They moved on. The report is still in their files. No investigation has been initiated. This is not a unique case. Researchers at the University of British Columbia who have had access to provincial LiDAR datasets for academic purposes have described, in conference presentations, in informal communications with colleagues, Multiple locations where terrain data suggests subsurface features of uncertain origin. The data exists. The expertise to interpret it exists. The institutional will to fund the ground truthing. The physical investigation that would determine what the anomalies represent does not. Ground-penetrating radar, which probes the subsurface directly, producing cross-sections that can distinguish between solid Earth, disturbed Earth, and voids, has been used in urban archaeology contexts in Victoria and Vancouver. Its use has been patchy, budget-constrained, never systematic enough to produce a comprehensive picture of the subsurface in any single city block. In other Canadian cities, ground-penetrating radar is used routinely as part of heritage management practice when construction is planned in historically significant areas. In Victoria and Vancouver, where the underground is arguably more historically significant than in any other Canadian cities, its use has been inadequate to the scale of the question. What a proper investigation would look like is not a mystery. It would begin with a province-wide survey of existing documentation. The Provincial Archaeological Register. The construction records in municipal archives across BC's major cities. The Dominion and provincial government records related to infrastructure from the colonial period forward. The military records from both world wars, and the ethnographic and oral history records held by university archives, provincial institutions, and First Nations communities. That documentation phase alone would be a multi-year project requiring a dedicated team. It has never been attempted. The field investigation that would follow. Priority sites including the Victoria Chinatown district, the Esquimalt Peninsula, the Fraser Canyon between Yale and Boston Bar, the Stein Valley, the Forbidden Plateau Cave System, the former Doukhobor village sites in the Kootenays, the Barkerville town site, and the wartime infrastructure sites in Prince Rupert would require a combination of LiDAR analysis, ground-penetrating radar surveys, hydrological mapping, and targeted physical investigation, where the non-invasive surveys identified features warranting examination. Every phase of that investigation, at every site on First Nations territory, would require Indigenous communities as genuine partners, not consultation, Kecox stakeholders, but co-investigators bringing knowledge to the investigation that the archaeological toolkit alone cannot access. This means years of relationship building before the research produces publishable results. It means a fundamentally different model of archaeological practice than the one that has operated in British Columbia for most of the province's history. The total cost of this investigation, properly scoped, would be in the range of several tens of millions of dollars over 10 to 15 years. This is not a small number. It is, however, a small fraction of the cost of the infrastructure projects. Highway expansions, pipeline corridors, urban developments that have repeatedly encountered underground features and destroyed them in the course of construction. The investment in understanding what is below British Columbia before it is built over would, in the long run, may save both the historical and the economic costs of managing underground surprises. This argument has been made to successive provincial governments by archaeologists and heritage professionals for a generation. It is correct. It has not been adequately heard. In the meantime, the accidental discoveries continue. In 2014, a homeowner in Victoria's James Bay neighborhood, working on the foundation of a house built in 1908, broke through a basement wall and found himself looking into a brick-lined passage roughly a meter wide. He documented it with photographs before calling the city. The city sent an inspector. The inspector confirmed the passage, noted that it ran in the direction of an adjacent lot, and advised the homeowner to seal it as a safety measure. No archaeological assessment was requested. The homeowner sealed the passage. His photographs are in his personal possession and have never been formally deposited in any archive. In 2017, gas line work on Government Street in downtown Victoria exposed a section of stone-laid flooring approximately 2 meters below the current street grade. Flooring inconsistent with any known construction on that block, tentatively dated by the consulting contractor to before 1860. The flooring was photographed. The city's heritage officer was notified and noted in the file that the find was potentially significant and recommended consultation with an archaeologist. No consultation took place. In 2021, construction of a residential development in Vancouver's Strathcona neighborhood encountered a series of wooden-lined shafts extending vertically downward from the basement excavation level. Tree ring dating placed the Douglas fir planks in the 1890s. The shafts extended to a depth of approximately 4 meters, opening into horizontal passages running east and west. The project archaeologist documented the shafts and requested a brief hold on that section of the excavation. After 2 days, excavation resumed. The passages were destroyed. These 3 discoveries, 2014, 2017, 2021, are representative of dozens of similar events in the last decade alone. Find. Brief documentation. Seal or destroy. Move on. The pattern is not the result of bad faith. The heritage officers and project archaeologists involved are professionals operating within institutional constraints they did not design. The constraints are the problem. Budget pressure, development timelines, the absence of a protocol for escalating significant underground discoveries to a level of response that would allow proper investigation. British Columbia does not have a protocol for handling significant underground archaeological discoveries in the course of development that is both fast enough to be compatible with construction schedules and rigorous enough to ensure that significant finds receive proper attention. Other jurisdictions, England, with its planning policy guidance for archaeology, being the most developed example, have built such systems over decades. British Columbia has not. What all of this amounts to: the Indigenous passages treated as mythology, the Chinatown tunnels reduced to tourist narrative, the wartime underground still partially classified, the Doukhobor infrastructure unassessed, the accidental discoveries consistently under-pursued, is a pattern of selective forgetting. Canadian historians use that phrase. Selective forgetting. National histories are not simply incomplete. Every history is incomplete because the past is vast and the record is always partial. National histories are selectively incomplete. They forget specific things for specific reasons. And the things they forget cluster around the experiences of people who did not hold power: Indigenous nations, immigrant communities, religious minorities, people whose survival required building things in places where the institutions above them could not easily reach. British Columbia's underground history is selective forgetting made physical. The passages are literally buried. The records are literally sealed. The oral traditions are literally classified as folklore. And every development project that builds over an unexamined void adds another layer of concrete above the evidence. But selective forgetting is not irreversible. Not yet. There are researchers working on this right now. A team at Simon Fraser University has been conducting a multi-year oral history project with First Nations elders across the province, documenting traditional knowledge about underground features and testing that knowledge against geological records. Their preliminary findings suggest that the oral traditions are significantly more accurate as geological documentation than the academic literature has previously acknowledged. An independent researcher in Victoria has spent the last decade building a database of accidental underground discoveries in the city. Newspaper records, construction logs, insurance claims, personal testimony, and the picture that emerges is of a subsurface Victoria substantially more complex than the official city archaeology suggests. A retired military officer who spent 30 years at CFB Esquimalt has been working on a privately published history of the base's infrastructure, a project that has stalled repeatedly because documents he needs remain classified. A Vancouver-based community historian has been interviewing elderly members of the Chinatown community for over a decade, gathering family accounts that describe specific passages, specific entrances, specific purposes, creating a map drawn not in measurements but in memory and story, a map that exists nowhere else. Each of these individuals works largely alone, without institutional support, without the resources to do more than scratch the surface of what the underground holds. And each of them has found in the fragments they have assembled enough to be certain that the full picture, if it could ever be assembled, would significantly change how British Columbia understands its own past. The window for assembling that picture is narrowing. The elders who hold knowledge of the oldest layers of the underground are aging. The veterans and construction workers who built the wartime installations are gone. The classified files sit in archives, while the events they document recede further into history. Every development project in Victoria and Vancouver and the cities of the interior encounters the underground at the rate of several times per decade and closes over it at the same rate. There is still time. Not unlimited time, but time enough if the commitment is made now to recover a significant portion of what has been lost, and to ensure that what remains underground in British Columbia is understood at last on its own terms. What lies at the bottom of the tunnels beneath British Columbia is not treasure in any conventional sense. There is no gold room. There is no single dramatic revelation waiting for the right investigator. What is down there is something more valuable than any of those things. Evidence. Evidence of the full range of human life in this province, across all the peoples, and all the eras, and all the purposes that have brought people to dig and carve and build beneath its surface. Evidence of survival under persecution. Evidence of wartime preparation. Evidence of spiritual practice and practical ingenuity, and the long, deep human engagement with this particular piece of the earth, stretching back so far that its beginning is still not clearly in view. The tunnels are British Columbia's underground archive. They are primary sources in the most literal possible sense. Physical records made by the hands of people who had reasons to make them, waiting in the dark for the historians who will take them seriously. Those historians have not yet fully arrived, but the evidence suggests that they are, at last, beginning to look in the right direction. Beneath the streets of Victoria, beneath the canyon walls of the Fraser, beneath the basalt bedrock of Prince Rupert, beneath the coastal bluffs where a geomorphologist flagged an anomaly in 2019 that no one has yet explained. The underground is there, and it is waiting. If you made it all the way through this investigation, thank you. This is exactly the kind of deep dive this channel was built for. No shortcuts. No surface-level history. The full story, with all its complexity intact. If you found this valuable, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. This channel covers Canadian history the way it actually happened. not the way it was cleaned up for the textbooks. New investigations go up regularly, and what's coming next in this series goes even deeper into the underground record. Leave a comment below telling us which layer of this underground history struck you most. The indigenous passages that predate European contact by thousands of years. The survival infrastructure the Chinese-Canadian community built when the surface world became a legal siege. The wartime tunnels the Canadian government still hasn't fully declassified, or the LiDAR anomaly sitting in an infrastructure agency's files right now. Unremarked and uninvestigated. Share this video with anyone who thinks they know British Columbia's history. There is a version of this place that the maps don't show. We're going to keep looking for it.